Hi folks, this is another Caspian report by me, Shivan. This time I'd like to talk about the image of enemy in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Anyone who understands the basics of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict knows that the role of enemy image has a substantial influence on the conflict. This creates certain phobias between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Some argue that by getting rid of these phobias, the parties will easily build confidence that would create the primary condition for peace in the region. And others argue that the conflict resolution is impossible without any psychological change. Each side is convinced of its absolute rightness and the lie of the enemy. These phobias and myths often reach absurd claims. Now, I've been going through the official and public Armenian arguments for the justification of the Karabakh conflict. First, it's claimed that as Armenians are indigenous people, they have a historic right to the territories of Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iran, and Georgia. Let me first say that there is little proof to show who are indigenous people in the Caucasus and who are not. Everyone has his or her truths, and by exalting the Armenian nation over others, it's just ordinary fascism. Let me also say that this argument refers to what is known as Greater Armenia, an ultra-nationalist political concept in which Armenia strives for territorial expansion from 29,800 square kilometers to 180,000 square kilometers, and in the process ethnically cleansing the territories from all non-Armenians. The second phobia. Azerbaijanis, like Turks, have always killed Armenians, including women and children. The reality of this argument is that Armenians often mix up Azerbaijanis and Turks by confusion and sometimes by just ignorance. Now, I'm not going to argue over what happened in 1915. This issue should be addressed by Armenians and Turks, as Azerbaijanis have nothing to do with this. During the time around 1915, carnage, ethnic cleansing, massacres were committed by Armenians with the aid of Russians in the Azerbaijani regions of Zangezur, Karabakh, Shamakhi, Baku, Guba, and other major cities. So Azerbaijan has its own black pages of history during that time, and it's of great importance not to confuse Azerbaijan and Turkey in this matter. The third argument reads as following. Armenians in Karabakh have always been oppressed and hated. Now, this is not a real allegation, as it's not supported by any evidence. It's merely a public opinion in Armenia. But for argument's sakes, I will explain the situation. Nagorno-Karabakh possessed all the essential elements of self-government. It had a population of around 189,000 people, of which around 73.5% were Armenians and 25.3% were Azerbaijanis. The remaining 1.2% were other nationalities. I should note that at the same time, about 200,000 Azerbaijanis lived in Armenia, but they were refused an autonomy, the Zangezur Autonomous Oblast. The Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast surpassed the remaining of Azerbaijan in almost every area. Based on population, there was more economic growth and investment in Nagorno-Karabakh. There were also more education, entertainment, and healthcare services in Nagorno-Karabakh in comparison with the remaining of Azerbaijan. So the allegations of discrimination against the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh do not stand up to its claims. Argument number 4. Armenians were expelled from Nakhchivan. Yes, that is true. At the present, there is no significant Armenian population there. But I would like to ask, what about the Azerbaijanis who once made up the absolute majority in Yerevan until early 20th century? And what about the 200,000 Azerbaijanis from Zangezur who made up the minority in Armenia during the Soviet era? And of course, why is it that there are 30,000 Armenians in Baku today while there are no Azeris in Armenia? So we should ask ourselves these crucial questions before accusing another party. Fifth argument. It was Azerbaijanis who first began the military conflict. Now, by this, Armenian sources primarily refer to the Sumgait riots in which 26 Armenians and 6 Azerbaijanis were killed. But if one would take time and research the origins of Sumgait riots, you will not be able to ignore two important facts that happened before Sumgait. First, there were mass deportations of Azerbaijanis from Gafan in Armenia to Azerbaijan. These deported people were all settled in Sumgait, which obviously increased tensions. Second, 2 teenage Azerbaijanis were shot in Nagorno-Karabakh by an Armenian police officer. Within hours that this news became public, riots started in Sumgait. So the statement that Azerbaijanis began the conflict first is unconvincing. Moving on to argument number 6. Armenians have right for self-determination. In most cases, self-determination refers to an ethnic group without a state. For example, Tibetans, Pashtuns, Shia Arab, etc. But what would be the logic of having self-determination, since Armenians already have an Armenian state? If this rule of self-determination could be applied on multiple occasions and situations, then it would mean that Armenia could have self-determination referendums in neighboring Georgia and Jafakati, or Glendale, California in the United States. But it would also mean that the deported Azerbaijanis from Zengezur would also have the right for self-determination. It's also worthy to note that Armenia pursued a policy of ethnic cleansing, and now asks for self-determination. That's like invading another country, kicking out the native people, and calling for self-determination. Let's not forget, self-determination is a UN resolution, but it does not give the right for annexation. The 7th argument. Rights of national minorities is violated in Azerbaijan. I find this question not only distasteful, but also quite amusing. I would first like to say, at least Azerbaijan has minorities, which contribute to enrich the culture of the Azerbaijani Republic. The fact is that Armenia is one of the most mono-ethnic countries in the world, with virtually no minorities. The Azerbaijanis were the last minorities in Armenia, and a century ago, they even made up the majority of the country. Argument number 8. Azerbaijan possesses nothing, except for oil and gas. Speaking on economic terms, exports by Azerbaijan does not only mean oil and gas. Azerbaijan produces and exports a variety of commodities and resources, and it's the only industrial country in the Caucasus. Facts and figures clearly show Azerbaijan has everything, plus oil and gas, which give Azerbaijan a vast and steady income of capital to be invested in other sectors of its economy. So unlike neighboring Armenia, Azerbaijan does not merely depend on foreign aid and exports of watermelons to develop its country. Continuing on to argument number 9. Azerbaijan does not respect human rights, and therefore Armenians will not be able to live under Baku's jurisdiction. Now, the last presidential elections in Armenia on March 1st, 2008 ended up with the deaths of dozens of civilians at the hands of the Armenian police and military personnel. So I would not say Armenia is the cradle of democracy or human rights. And several international observers would argue that the elections were not democratic at all, and that the treatment of protesters were much like an authoritarian state. Now, this kind of treatment has not been recorded in Azerbaijan. And finally, the 10th argument. Azerbaijan does not display constructive position by constantly threatening the resumption of hostilities. I would argue that if Azerbaijani military threats are considered unconstructive, then what exactly does Armenia display by continuing the occupation of Azerbaijani territories for almost 16 years? Every country has the basic right to defend itself, and Azerbaijan is doing nothing different. Why does Armenia avoid the 4 UN resolutions which demand the withdrawal of Armenian troops from the occupied territories? Azerbaijan's military threats are understandable, as about 20% of its lands are now occupied by a foreign country, which also resulted in the displacement of more than 1 million people. Azerbaijan is building up its economy and bolstering its military, and after more than a decade of fruitless negotiations, Azerbaijan is running out of patience. But the Azerbaijani president has on numerous occasions stated that diplomacy is the hope for solving the conflict, and should this fail, military measures would be taken. The list of myths and phobias can become infinite. I'm far from arguing that all the ideas voiced in Azerbaijan are absolutely correct. Of course, both sides have certain phobias and complexes, but there is one truth to this all. The longer the negotiations process will last, the more phobias, myths, and falsehoods will appear. It's high time to put an end to the conflict, because I believe it's possible for both the communities of Nagorno-Karabakh to live together. I will leave you with an old Azerbaijani saying: it does not matter where the horse stands, before or behind the cart, as long as the cart moves in the right direction.